Reverend Bodhi B. You're a minister, a hospice worker, a funeral director, green burial expert, coffin maker. My question to you is, when you meet somebody at a party, what do you tell them that you do?
If I go to a party at all these days, most everybody knows who I am. That's funny. I went and apprenticed at a crematory, and I asked the guy that ran the crematory that very question. And because how do you get a date if you tell somebody you work at a crematory? And so he started just saying he was in sales, and I thought that was. Yeah. But most people know what I do when I go to a party. But certainly, I'm an ordained minister that is the executive director of a nonprofit that works in the community, educational, charitable. We put on lots of programs, and we run a nonprofit certified green funeral home, and we do a lot of counseling and education. In a nutshell, when somebody says, "Who are you? What do you do?" It'd be more like a stranger asked me that. And, people know me in a lot of different contexts. The ministry I'm ordained in is this Western Sufi lineage, and a lot of people know me through my teachings as a spiritual teacher. And a lot of people just know me because I've been here for 45 years on Maui, and that kind of itself makes me somebody in this community, although Maui's changed tremendously, and a lot of people have no idea who I am or what I do, which is great too. The paparazzi don't follow me into the stores as much anymore.
That's amazing. Yeah, so you're going to lead a course at Esalen called "What's Death Got to Do with It?" Embracing aging, dying, and death as a path to living fully. Can you talk to me about what you'll be teaching in this course?
Well, as someone who's been a minister and a counselor for 35 years, and very much involved in how do we get people to wake up, and how do we transform human consciousness, because it became very clear to me at an early age that to be most effective in any area of life, the more awake we are, the more conscious we are of who we are and why we're here and connected to our calling and our purpose, the more effective we're going to be in any area we choose to engage in life. So what I came to through my path as a seeker of what are the practices, what are the ways to become more embodied and realized in daily life, not as a transcendent experience to sit on a mountaintop, but how to engage in the marketplace in a very awakened, a conscious, open-hearted, kind and generous way. And what I came to was that death itself and the awareness of death, not as something that we know in our heads, because we all know we're going to die, we don't know when, but we don't really know that as an embodied, realized experience. And what I discovered was nothing seems to shake us out of what I call the cultural hypnotic sleepwalk as a close experience with death. That is to say, we see death all the time. It's all over the news. I mean, what's happening in India right now is horrific. And of course, what's happening all over the world, you could say, in some ways, is just tragedy. There's so much tragedy in the midst of so much beauty and magic. And we're kind of jaded to it. And we're not really touched by death to some degree because, in a way, we've had to armor ourselves and protect ourselves. Many of us are really too sensitive for what's happening out there. But what happens when somebody close to us finds out they're dying, or when we get a diagnosis, or we find out we're dying, or when we get the phone call that somebody died that we love and care about, something seems to happen to all of us that shakes us out of this cultural sleepwalk and pushes us right into this place of how precious life is, how fleeting it is, what's most important in our lives, how quickly things can change. Those are the kind of things that, to me, I would call a very beautiful, powerful spiritual experience that brings us into the moment and brings us into the fragility and preciousness of life, and pushes us towards, well, what's most important. And when we realize we may not have as much time as we think. And I call that really a close encounter with death, a near-death experience. And we have been, as a culture, we're so into the new and what's next and the new phone and the latest gadget, and we've pushed old off the edge of relevancy. And so even everybody wants to live a long time, but nobody really wants to be an old person. And we're actually pressured to keep looking young and fit and active, even in our 70s and 80s and et cetera. And I think it causes a lot of stress and anxiety, especially at this time in the world when there is a lot of stress and anxiety about what's happening and what's coming. So using death really as a teaching spiritual practice, really, to help us become intimately friends with our approaching death and the approaching death of everyone we love and care about. That we're going to say goodbye to everyone we love and care about. That, that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is when we tune to, maybe it's not too soon to start thinking about the fact that we might die one day. And we start doing the work of what I call preparing for death, and not leaving it until we're on our deathbed when it's really hard to do that work. And by engaging in that work now, and a lot of that work is about relationships. There's too many times where somebody's on their deathbed wanting to talk to their son who's 6,000 miles away, because there's so much. We leave a trail. We're all leaving a trail. So that's another piece. And the other piece is, how can we really show up when the people around us that we love and care about are dying? How can we meet that in a way that we can bring benefit to someone who's dying? So that, in a nutshell, is really what has got me more and more into teaching about, how do we transform ourselves? How do we come, people say to me, what do you think about life after death? And my answer usually is, I'm more interested in, is there life before death? And how do we become fully alive and add beauty and kindness to the world and to ourselves?
When you work with people who have received a terminal prognosis, what are some of the common reactions that they have? Is there sort of anxiety that often people have to work with? Yeah. How do you help people?
Again, this idea that when I ask 100 people, how many people know you're going to die and you don't know when, and 100 people raise their hands and look at me like, what a dumb question. But the truth is, when I look around, few people really look like they live like that's true. Most of us think we have lots of time, this sense of entitlement that we deserve to live to 80 years old. Now, when it's a more realized experience and we live in that truth, not where we're just on the edge of, oh my God, we're going to die and we don't know when. But, that's the challenge, really. How do we dance and play around and goof off and love everybody in the midst of how fragile it is? So when you know you're going to die and you don't know when, it doesn't really come as a surprise to you when you find out you're dying. But because most people don't live in that truth, it's a shock. It's a sudden, oh my God. And of course, for most people, it is shocking. And sometimes those people go to see the doctor and they can't even hear what the doctor is saying because they're so in shock and, oh my God, is this really happening? So is there anxiety? Is there stress? Is there fear? Is there anger? All of that and more for most everyone I meet. I mean, some people are like, okay, I'm ready to meet that. I've been living my life full enough and have worked on myself and my relationships enough, and I'm willing to engage in the work face forward of meeting my dying time. When I ask 100 people, what's your favorite version of death and dying? As you can imagine, most everybody says, I want to die in my sleep. Now, what they're saying is they don't want to be dying for years and then die in their sleep. What they're saying is they want to skip the dying part altogether. Now that's a really big piece in my view, because it's kind of like we don't see any value in dying. We want to skip the dying part, and we've seen too many horror stories either on TV or we've heard about them to be afraid of the dying part. Since most people now are dying in for long periods of time,
Mm.
and very few people think that looks good.
I
So
was
yeah,
listening to
all of those feelings and more.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview that you did with Ram Dass, and the two of you were speaking about the ego actually going through a process of dying when one knows that they are going to die in the near future. I was wondering if you could speak about that, about this transition from ego to soul.
In our in our spiritual lineage, there's one of the teachers said a long time ago, "Die before you die." And what he was speaking to was there's two kinds of death. There's the death we were just speaking about, is when we stop breathing and our heart stops beating and our body dies. The other kind of dying is the dying of this sense of the importance of the self, the ego. And Ramdas we didn't see eye to eye about the function of the ego. Um, I think the ego is a very critically important piece in terms of how spirit reveals itself through each of us, that we have a viewpoint, and the fact that we all look different and see things differently is a beautiful gift to the universe, because we're all creative in different ways because of the way we see. So the ego is a beautiful thing, but we get caught in thinking that we're this thing that's the separate self, the separate isolated self, and we're in competition with everyone else and everything else. And it's all about me. In fact, we're in a culture where it's all about me. Just do it, have it your way. Independence, which I think is an illusion. There's really no such thing as independence. We're all interdependent. So there's this small self that I would call the ego, which is critically important. The problem is it gets bashed in this culture. The ego's the problem. The ego's the problem, and it's this. Basically, it's the replay of there's something wrong with us, and now we can call it the ego. And actually, there's nothing wrong with us. The only thing wrong with us is we think there's something wrong with us, and we've somehow disconnected ourselves from the holy itself, and we've disconnected ourselves from nature and think somehow we're above and beyond the laws of nature. And maybe that's the most shocking thing about finding out you're dying, is that it's the wake up call that just like everything else in nature, we die too. What was your question? Oh, the ego. So we want to, we identify with, who are you? And how many people say, well, I do this job and I'm this active and I have this many kids and I have this family and I have this much money and I've traveled to all those places, and on and on and on and on. Well, when you find out you're dying, in fact, when you're dying, all of those things start to fall away. You're, even now, here I am almost 70, I can't do the things I did so well in my 20s. Right? I had to let go of that, right? Right? Letting go of this notion that I had to be somebody. Of course, as a kid, we had to become a somebody. That's the development of the psychology of becoming. And at some point, we have to realize, first of all, we're so much more than what we think. We're so much more than this body. We are connected to everyone and everything, and the holiness itself reveals itself right through us directly. And there's something much bigger going on, and we want to tune to that so that it guides us in our life. And how do we tune to that? We continually let go of this small sense of I, me, mine. And that's the practice really of, I would say that's the practice of life, is learning how to let go. And in fact, change. We're so poorly trained in adapting to change. We don't like change. We like to know things are going to be the way they are. We want to be comfortable. We want it to be convenient. And of course, that's the cause of so much stress and fear, especially right now at this time, because clearly we're not in control. So I think that speaks a little bit to your question.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, I'm curious. How long have you done this? I mean, are you the only person you know who's in this work, or has it become much more common to be a person who professionally grapples with death and helps people grapple with it?
I think that's been going on forever, but certainly there's a movement now, and I think once again that not just the baby boomers, but the baby boomers really have changed everything we've touched pretty much. Alternative healthcare, natural foods, organic farming, on and on and on and on. Having babies at home. You name it, we've touched it, and and many of us have helped change it in very beautiful and powerful ways that are now part of mainstream culture. So now the baby boomers are in their, I don't know, 60s to 80s, are now watching their parents die and their friends die. And many of us started to look at, well, what's happening out there? And of course, most people have had pretty lousy experiences in the dying and death world, which is pretty corporatized at this point. Even the hospice movement, which is such a beautiful, important movement, for the most part, many new hospices are for-profit businesses because there's so much money in Medicare and insurance and government, but also consequently, it's becoming much more controlled and monitored. So there's a movement now, positive death movement. There's a number of fields where this is opening up. I mean, I don't think we're certainly not the only green funeral home in the U.S. We're the only one in Hawaii, and in fact, we're the only nonprofit funeral home in Hawaii, because our mission is really to help take it out of the world of business, money, selling you stuff. The other funeral homes on this island are owned by the two biggest corporations in the funeral industry in America. And if you look into it, the funeral industry, the cemetery industry, the casket making industry, they're billion-dollar industries, often employing very toxic practices. And people are paying too much money. Even death discriminates against poor people, not death itself, but to be able to deal with it.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the environmental impact of corporatized death industry and the changes that you're attempting to make with your nonprofit in greening death?
If we take the cemetery, for example, how the cemetery came about was initially everybody, when we were nomadic people, we buried grandma along the trail. And in fact, next year, when we followed the herd, we knew where Grandma was buried because the grass was taller there and we could go visit Grandma. Then we settled down and we were burying everybody, certainly burying our family members in the backyard. Then there were churches, and churches started to have cemeteries, and people wanted to have their family members buried in the church graveyard. Then we became a more secular people and more living in cities, and that became the modern cemetery movement. If you look at the cemetery movement, or the common model of the cemetery that you see, which has taken over more than 1 million acres in America, it's one single purpose, gravestones, taken out of the public domain forever. Removing land from the public domain forever for one single purpose. It doesn't make sense, and it's expensive. It's gotten very expensive. And most cemeteries force you to have either a plastic or a concrete grave liner, which is a box that the casket goes inside of. People are still buying expensive metal caskets that are getting buried in the ground. Tropical hardwoods from all over the world, Indonesia. A tremendous amount of concrete, plastic, metal going into the ground every year. And that doesn't account for the amount of embalming fluid, because people are still being embalmed with toxic formaldehyde. Formalin is a known World Health Organization and a known cancer-causing chemical. Hundreds of thousands of gallons going into the ground every year. The cemeteries force you to have a grave liner, for the most part, to keep the ground level so that it's easier for them to mow. So we're talking about maintenance and at the expense of your pocketbook. Okay? So, cemeteries, concrete, plastic, metal, embalming fluid, not to mention the chemicals they spray on the grass to keep the grass down. Okay? That's the cemetery model. So it doesn't make sense and it's too expensive, which is why more and more people are turning to cremation, which is way less costly, but very poisonous to the air. A lot of fuel has to be burned. Quite a bit of fuel has to be burned. And the carbon from your body is going up in the atmosphere when it really ought to be returned to the earth. So there's a green burial movement to not only be able to bury people, and we do, we'll bury people in cloth shrouds or cardboard boxes or simple wooden caskets, and that's one of the things I do. I make a simple, pretty, in fact, you can see one behind me. In a hole, period. No grave liner, no box. Well, the green burial movement even went one step further to where people can plant things on top of those graves, were scientifically proven to be good fertilizer. And then one step further is now cemeteries are partnering with conservation groups, right? Nature Conservancy as an example, to where a cemetery is now becoming the economic engine to help maintain an open woodland or an open space, greenway, to keep land in the public commons for multi-purpose use, recreation, contemplation, meditation. And also, I would say, to help us heal this separation between life and death. And we have a model to actually take that step even further, to create a community center and a children's park in the midst of a green burial ground. Again, multi-purpose, kept in the public domain forever, rather than removing land for gravestones. And again, coming back to taking something back that we gave away to industry, that is costing us a lot of money, and it's costing us environmentally in terms of the environmental damage being done by big business. Not all funeral homes are big business. There's still plenty of mom and pop funeral homes. But just like small mom and pop farms, they're having to compete and upgrade to compete with corporate funeral homes. I mean, those corporate funeral homes could see the baby boomer generation coming, and they, good times ahead, and have been planning for it for quite a while. So to really, it's not something that should have anything to do with a money exchange, really. I mean, of course, we've got to pay rent here, but this is about sacred community work that we need to reclaim as a community. If we just meet at parties, we're not a true community. We're not a real village. We have to show up for each other in the hard times, in caring for our people who are dying and sick and dying, and caring for people who are dead. We bring families in here to actually wash and dress their loved ones. I have a beautiful image of these two twin boys nailing the nails into the coffin lid that their grandpa is in, and absolutely precious.
Yeah, that brings up a question when you talk about caring for the people who are dealing with death of a family member or a friend. I imagine that's part of your counseling work. You describe grief as the sister of love. So yeah, can you speak to me about the ways that you might not just help people who are grappling with dying themselves, but people who have lost loved ones?
We used to officiate a lot of weddings, my wife and I, and sometimes I would say, in making a vow to spend the rest of your life with your partner, included in that vow is that one of you is going to witness the death of your partner. That's in the deal, if you're going to live the rest of your life with this person. And that's the truth, that we're going to say goodbye to everybody we love and care about until they say goodbye to us. So we're everybody and everything we love will die. It's embedded in this very moment. And a part of us is already grieving that we're going to say goodbye. We're going to lose this. Whether it's, I mean, I read something the other day that said in the next generation there might not be any birds in the world. Boy, if that doesn't make you cry. I mean, who's not grieving? If you're paying attention, who's not grieving what's happening in the world right now? The tremendous injustice, the tremendous suffering, nature on the run, lakes that you can't swim in anymore, on and on and on. Um, so when people come to me for counseling because somebody's dying, or they're dying, or somebody has died, and they're having problems, most often, almost always, the problem that they're having is they're either not allowing themselves to let the grieving have its way with them, or because they want to be in control. And grieving's not about being in control. And also, we're so addicted to doing things right that we're afraid we're not grieving right, or our partner's not grieving right. And who's more self-critical? Who's more critical of ourselves than we are? Constantly beating ourselves up that we're not doing it right or correctly, or what's the problem, or what's wrong with me, or how come a year later I am still can hardly get out of bed because my husband died or my son died. And you go to see your friends, and your friends are like, wow, maybe you do need to see someone, like there's something wrong. Of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And the notion that you're supposed to get over your grief, to me, it does tremendous harm, detrimental harm to us as a people, that we're supposed to get over it and move on and fix it and get back to work or whatever it is. That to grieve, in fact, not just to grieve, but to grieve out loud amongst your people together is tremendously, it's so big. It's talk about village building, community building, because a lot of us are grieving but don't have a place to take it, and don't feel like we need therapy, and we don't, in fact. What we do sometimes need our friends to keep an eye on us, so we're eating and sleeping. I'm around mothers whose children have tragically died, and they don't want to get out of bed. In fact, they wish they were dead, and don't get out of bed. And hey, I say don't get out of bed. Take as long as it takes, and also, I want to make sure your friends are aware of making sure they're checking in on you and they're loving you, and getting you out for walks and getting you into nature, which to me is the greatest healer of them all, being out in nature. So, we're you could say we're grief illiterate in this culture because we're such a business culture, and it gets in the way of being efficient and getting back to work. And that, again, that's done tremendous harm to us as a people, to feel that there's something wrong with us, that we're still grieving. I met a woman who was grieving an abortion she had 40 years ago. Amen. Amen. I mean, how could that not change you and live on in you and help shape who you are and who you become?
Thank you so much for those thoughts. I was really tuning into that. You've said, I kind of poked around on your website and listened to some interviews by you, and you use turns of phrases really well. You're funny. You've said death needs better PR, and I'm wondering, do you use humor to help people who are grappling with death and with dying?
Well, yes, and it's a very fine line. I want to bring lightness to it without treating it too lightly. I mean, I made a T-shirt that says "If found dead, call the death store," and it's got my phone number on it. Um,
And
yes, I
you
want to
do
bring.
you do have something called the Death Store, yeah?
I'm sitting in the death store. You're looking at it, which is a community educational resource center for anyone who's curious enough to want to educate themselves about death. Um, And also, people come in here who are dying or whose family member just died, and there's a whole wide spectrum of people that come in here. And people gave me a lot of grief about, you can't call it the death store. I love what you're doing, Bodhi, but you can't call it the death store. And I couldn't look myself in the mirror if it was the till we meet again store, or the you know um, death, dead, and die are like taboo words in this culture now. You could say the dog died, the car died, the phone died, but most everybody says grandma passed away or passed on. And again, I think that's very harmful to us as a people. Yes, I get it. I know what passed away means. Graduates, left their bodies, transitioned. I've heard most of them by now, and I'm in alignment with pretty much all of them. Although I don't like past. It's too much like gas, And but to leave out death and die and dead is detrimental to us as a people. And so I just thought, well, I'm just gonna put it out there, the death store. And I meet people who say they'd never come into a store called the death store. I think there ought to be one next to every Starbucks in America, or inside of every Starbucks in America, or I kind of backed off maybe every other Starbucks in America, but it ought to be in the community, as it is in some cultures, that death is part of village life. In Bali, sometimes there's a whole procession of the body being carried down through the village, and everybody stops. And in America, it's let's hide the whole thing and make it invisible, which is why most people haven't been around a dead body, and most people are freaked out about the whole thing because it's not part of daily. It's not in the mall. It's not in the community commons, and most funeral homes want to actually protect you, or think they're protecting you by keeping you away from seeing the dead body.
It seems that there's so many different ideologies surrounding death, with regards to what happens next. You've got the afterlife people, you got reincarnation people, you got your people who just believe there's nothingness. Do you find that differing philosophies help people who are grappling with this huge question of what's going to happen?
Oh yeah, sure. People that have a strong belief that they're going to go be with Jesus, or they're going to go meet their loved ones who have died. Absolutely, a strong belief. However real, I have no idea how real it is. It's interesting when you think about it. When people say, "Yeah, I'm going to go be with my husband who died 10 years ago," and if you think about it, it's fascinating because he died 10 years ago. Is that the past? But you're going to die soon, and you're going to go be with your husband in the future. So where is your husband? Is he in the past or is he in the future? It's a fascinating question to consider in terms of what is time? How does time itself work? But yeah, people are comforted, and in fact, people are very anxious and afraid if they don't have a strong sense of where they think they're going.
Mm-hmm. And what about you? Have you been able to formulate a kind of philosophy or ideology around your thoughts around what am I helping people accept? What will happen to this person who I'm counseling?
Well, no, I don't have a philosophy. Or what was the other one? Philosophy.
Ideology, I guess.
I know I'm done with philosophy and ideology. But as I become more realized and embodied in the truth of who I am, which is really one of the points of being embodied as a human, is to find out who you are and why you're here, that we in fact do have a purpose. In fact, we have a calling. And I could speak to what that means in terms of where is the calling coming from. When you find out who you are, it's obvious where you're going and where you're going to be when you leave this body. I used to say, well, we're not the body. I don't say that anymore. I've seen too much around. I've met people after they're dead, And actually, it's been very moving for us to actually get to connect and meet people after they're dead, not in some, strange, a ghost-like way, but in just feeling them through their body itself. So I would say now that we're not just the body; we're way more than just the body. In fact, we're more than the mind itself. So I think I personally have a couple of different pictures about where I go, and I don't know if any of it's true. And in fact, I love the mystery, not the Sherlock Holmes kind of mystery that wants to be solved, but the mystery that doesn't want to be solved, that just wants to be lived in, so that we're more in curiosity and wonder and openness than to think we have to know where we're going. But of course that's very scary to many people, and I think that's the practice of being alive, is to let go of trying to control it all. And I think most of us are control freaks, whether we admit it or not. We think we know what's going on, and we know what's gonna happen next, and we want to know, and that causes a tremendous amount of anxiety, especially at this time. I mean, here we are a year later, and one day we were all wearing masks, and the day before, who would have imagined that things could change that quickly around the world? And we're maybe still in shock from that experience. And then we had all of a sudden we had to self-isolate. And for people who've never had that experience, I'm sure that was very intense, to self-isolate and be with yourself and look at all the ways you distract yourself to not have to actually sit there and feel what you're actually feeling. So many of us are leaning forward. What's next? What's next? What's next? Rather than being fully embodied in this moment. And maybe because many of us don't want to feel what we actually feel, that we don't love our job, that we don't love our relationship, that we don't love ourselves. And we'd rather continue to what's next and lean forward into Facebook and entertainment and Netflix and whatever it is. We're great at it in this culture: sex, drugs, rock and roll, you name it, food. We are supreme in distractions. So then we had to self-isolate, right? And then we had this close encounter with death. No, maybe most of us know people who got COVID and died. All of a sudden death is in the room. It always was. Nothing really changed, but all of a sudden there it was. And again, maybe we're still in shock and really grieving what has become of the story that's playing out. So I don't know. I forget what you asked me.
No, that's great. I love listening to you. And it's such valuable thoughts. So I'm kind of letting them wash over me, and I'm thinking my thoughts, and just getting a lot out of it. Ram Dass said that.
Oh, PR. Hold on a second.
Yeah.
PR. Yeah, the Grim Reaper. That whole thing. The Grim Reaper. Sometimes I'm out there dressed up as the Grin Reaper. It's like, how do we not just accept the truth that we're going to die, but love the fact that we're going to die? This whole idea that, people want to live forever. Really? I mean, if you really play that through, that looks like hell to me. That nothing changes and we get to stay the same. The beauty of, if you garden and you see or spend time in wild nature, not manicured nature, but real nature, you see that life and death are in this beautiful dance together, interweaving. It doesn't happen without death. Everything we eat comes from things that grew out of death. What is soil? It's not just dirt. It's all this stuff that has died. It's the bones of our people and the bones of everything else that has died, that is feeding the food we eat, no matter what we eat. How do we fall in love with this death part and recognize that it's right here with us? And it's not this mean grin reaper. It's this great teaching that wants to help us become more fully alive. Too many of us are the walking dead and just waiting to die, or waiting for finally I'm gonna, I meet people who are, wait a minute, I can't be dying now. I haven't gotten to live the life. I haven't gotten to live my life yet. These aren't young people either. These are the people who live their parents' life or their teacher's life or their friend's life or their culture's life. And that's part of the reason why we're in the mess that we're in the world today. So yeah, we need better PR, and sometimes I bring a lot of playfulness to it. But I'm seen in a lot of different lights in this community, and I want to bring lightness to it without treating it too lightly. Death is the experience of a lifetime.
And Ram Dass said that death is like taking off a shoe that's too tight. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, and talk to me a little bit about your relationship with Ram Dass and how you came to work with one another?
First of all, I don't remember having died in any other lifetimes, so I can't really say death is like taking off a shoe that's too tight. That's what it looks like when I'm around people, when at the moment when they actually die. But I couldn't tell you I know that's true. And actually, I think many people are more afraid of the dying part than the dead part, right? I think many people are actually freaked out about the dying part. They're freaked out about finding out they're dying, right? I mean, sometimes you see the sign on grandma's door, don't tell her she's dying. Because we equate with knowing that you're dying with suffering. And I could teach for half a day on suffering itself, because we don't see any value in suffering. So Ram Dass changed my life when I was 17, and I saw Be Here Now, and I started listening to some of the things he was saying. And he was 15 years older than me, but when I was 17, 15 years older than me, he was an old person. And he was the first old person that actually made sense to me. Because when I looked around at my parents and their friends, they didn't know anything. They were just, they were just caught in making a living and getting drunk on the weekends. I mean, that's a little generalized, but that's pretty close to how it was. And Ram Dass made sense. And at a time when I was 17 and 18 and starting to experiment with marijuana and psychedelic drugs, he broke through, just as the psychedelics did. They broke through. It's like that picture of the guy, the painting of the guy sticking his head out of this sphere of the world he was living in into, and there's the universe. And we've all seen that image. And it was like that for me. In fact, right around that time, my dad suddenly died. And that whole world kind of cracked open, and Ram Dass was a voice that seemed to be a voice of sanity. The first one for me, really. Be Here Now. And again, there were only a couple of spiritual books around. Autobiography of a Yogi, for example, Teachings of the Far East. There were only a few really spiritual books out there in mainstream. And Be Here Now just cut right to it. And so then I started listening to Ram Dass, and then Ram Dass came to Maui, and then Ram Dass decided to stay on Maui, and then Ram Dass moved down the street from me. And at that time, Ram Dass was inviting the community of spiritual people in that particular ray, bhakti, devotional singing, to his home every Sunday. And we'd come over and we'd sing and chant, and we'd have a meal together. And I at that time, I had time, I had a truck, I had tools. Now I have a truck and tools, but I don't have a lot of time. And so I said to the household, hey, if you ever need any help, I got tools, I have truck, I have time. And so they started inviting me over to do little projects for them. And then I was working in Ram Dass's bedroom, making a ramp for him so he could get in and out of the sliding door onto his deck without having to get somebody to help him. And I started, and at this point, I was already, I had become a hospice volunteer. I was going and sitting in the homes of dying people, which I'd never done before. That was a new thing. It was like going to the school of how do people actually do this thing, and really studying how do people actually do this thing, the dying part. And then as a business person, I've had a number of businesses. I started looking around at the cemetery industry, the funeral industry, the casket making industry, and the hospice institutions, and the medical story of dying. And I thought, there's something really missing here. It's broken. There's something missing here. And I know that the Buddhists were speaking to it a bit. And Ram Dass had actually started a movement in the 60s around conscious dying. Joan Halifax, Dale Borglum, Frank Ostaseski, Stephen Levine, a number of people. And so there was this conscious dying movement that maybe had been going on, but Ram Dass really brought it out into our community. So then I started so then I was already formulating, I wanted to start something that was bigger than just the Buddhists presenting something, and they do a beautiful job. The Buddhists seem to have death more in the forefront of their story, even though the Christians have Jesus on a cross. So I was already starting to formulate starting a nonprofit with my wife around this whole piece, around education and trying to transform and really taking the whole conscious dying and death movement forward, doing my part to do that. And I started to talk to, I got to meet Ram Dass, and at that point Ram Dass was like, I didn't have a big thing about rock stars and movie stars and famous athletes. I really didn't have that thing going, but I did have that thing going for Ram Dass. So it was pretty tricky to actually be around Ram Dass. So I had to work my way through that, and he wanted me to work my way through that so that we could just be, soul to soul, person to person. And we started talking and meeting each other and getting to know each other a little bit more as people rather than as Ram Dass. And we did. And I told him what I was doing and what I wanted to do. And he said, well, I want to help you. I mean, obviously, I've been doing this work for 40 years. I want to help you do what you're doing. And he became one of the founders of our project, Doorway into Light. And then we put on a big event in 2006, basically to see who in the Maui, Hawaii community was interested in this whole piece. And we invited some other teachers and beautiful people. And 100 and something people showed up for 3 days in the rain under a big white tent. And that really became the beginning of me and Ram Dass and I collaborating on creating events here, often inviting teachers from the mainland, often inviting teachers he knew that I couldn't just call up. And that became really the beginning of what became Doorway into Light. And how it got to be how it is today, well, that's even a longer story. But so Ram Dass as a collaborator, as a mentor, as a friend, as a neighbor. We didn't always agree. I mean, we certainly clashed about this ego thing, but we see each other. I mean, he's still very much in my life. I keep him on the board. So I mean, that's kind of a bit about. I mean, Ram Dass and I have been through a lot together, and I feel very fortunate that we got to be friends and collaborators for the last chapters of his life. And then I got to help him after he died. I got to help his staff wash him and prepare him and really set him out so that the community could come sit with him for 3 days. And then we brought him to our facility here in our body refrigerator and for more ceremony from his inner family, and then we caravaned down and I helped coordinate his people to be able to push him into the fire and start the fire. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, really, just sort of winding down here, just a question or two more. Can we do two more?
I have a little time. I'm good with you.
Okay, I think we could just do two shorties. You mentioned psychedelics in passing. What do you think about there's all these studies that are coming out right now, I think went through Johns Hopkins, and the studies talk about the use of psychedelics with a therapist in order to ease some of the end of life anxiety. Just wondering if that's part of what you think is effective or perhaps unnecessary.
I think at some point we're going to develop a piece of what we do here to help guide people through psychedelic experiences who are dying. And I think psilocybin and ketamine maybe at this point may be the most useful medicines, and I call them medicines, to help people in their fear and anxiety. If you have a deeply spiritual connection and a spiritual practice, and you've already kind of opened up to the truth of who you are and how big we really are and how connected we really are to everything else, I don't think you need any psychedelics at all or anything really. A lot of people have not had those experiences to where those experiences have become embodied and realized. Lots of people have had cool experiences, but most people have not had that experience become embodied and realized, and the truth of how they walk in life or how we walk in life. And for many people that go into tremendous fear and anxiety, I think psychedelics can be extremely helpful. Oftentimes the fear and anxiety get in the way of being able to face forward, work with dying as a practice, and really not just for oneself, but we need to learn how to die well. And so we need models of people. We need to see people who are engaged in their dying face forward, meeting their dying and doing the work that is dying, that is really the work of completing one's life and coming to peace with one's life and healing relationships with oneself and with others and with something bigger than oneself and others. So in that sense, I think psychedelics will become certainly one of the tools of how we embrace and meet our dying time.
So there might be someone who's listened to this wonderful talk, this interview that you've created here, and they just feel kind of interested in this work. Do you have any kind of advice for people who might be up and coming grief counselors or death doulas?
I'm hesitant to give any advice. First of all, I think you called me a green burial expert. I don't consider myself an expert in any field. Again, I come back to what I said early on, that to be effective in any area of your life, whether it's a plumber, or whether it's a counselor or minister or a nurse or doctor, to the degree that you are awakened in your own being and to recognize the truth that we are souls meeting beyond the story of you dying and I'm the helper, that to be able to meet in that place soul to soul, that's where the greatest healing is. We want to be seen. And so we need people who can see us. And so we need people who are awake enough and open and clear enough and big enough to see us. Sometimes I'm with a dying person and everybody else just sees the dying person. Oh, that's so sad. And for them, it can be really difficult to just be seen as a dying person. So then I meet people that don't tell anybody they're dying because they don't want to be seen as the person with cancer or the dying person, because so much so we are so hungry to be seen all the way in. And so again, it comes back to how awake are you is how effective you will be in any field you get into. And of course, the grief thing, like, I don't think we need grief counselors. I just think we need grief coaches. People don't need to be counseled about their grief. People just need to be encouraged and supported to let it take you. Let it have you lose control for a while and see where that takes you, because what I see is nobody gets lost in that. Well, I won't say nobody, and maybe people can get lost in it, but I would guess it's because there's not enough community support around that person to help and support them to go through, because grieving wants to happen. Grieving itself is the healing that wants to work its way through to change us. So my advice to people in any field, but especially in this death and dying work, is to cultivate a real deep spiritual relationship with something that is real and shows up in your life in the daytime. That was like once that was your idea of a simple question.
Reverend Bodhi B, tell us how to learn more about your work, how to find you online or on Maui. Thank you.
We thank you, Sam. We've got a great website, doorwayintolight.org. We have a vision for a beautiful land project at ipuka.org, ipuka.org. Um, Email me. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. Better yet, come to Maui and come actually meet us. And I have a great team of people working with me here. And I think the Death Store really ought to be all over the country. I'm not going all around the country to cut tapes at the Death Store, not yet anyway. But come see what we're doing, or certainly I email. I'm open to communicating with anybody that wants to reach out. Bodhi at doorwayintolight.org. Um, the website's pretty good. Thanks for asking.
Oh man, thank you so much for this. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. And certain things that you said definitely hit me in unexpected ways. And yeah, I really felt like I was absorbing some of your teachings.
Beautiful. Beautiful. You ask good questions.
Thank you, brother.
Right on, Sam. Appreciate it.